we all have arrived in the United States, from Latin America and the Caribbean, with that dual experience. The experience of popular Catholicism that sustains our lives, and the experience of the more traditional, liturgical-based, church-based Catholicism, no? And then we find ourselves moving and making it all the way through Mexico and coming here, no? And then we start going through all parishes. And what's happening? That we collide in many of our communities. We collide because many of these churches, for instance, one of the biggest battles I remember in my own parish at the beginning, when we began Hispanic ministry in my parish, you know, the Anglo community, they love their organ. I mean, it's just beautiful organ, and we got their choir and so on. But the Latino community, you know, mostly Caribbean, brought their guitars and their, you know, and their congas and their, you know, many other instruments and microphones, and it's just like a big merengue salsa fiesta, you know? So it was just great. So, and then, you know, add to that the quinceañeras and the popular devotions, and add the flexibility of clapping and dancing during Mass and so on. And my friends in the Anglo community would look and say, like, what is this? We have never experienced that, you know? But people here have experienced it. And people have experienced it in other parts of the world. If we were talking today about, for instance, Black Catholicism, what I am saying is very similar to the African experience and other experiences throughout the world. So I want you to understand that, because if you understand this historical piece, everything that I'm going to say from now on will click right away, okay? So Hispanics in the liturgy. Do Hispanics go to Mass? Yes, absolutely. Do Hispanics love the liturgy? Absolutely. Like every other Catholic in the United States, of America. So we got a beautiful experience. So Hispanics, like many other Catholics, you know, partake of what we call the Catholic imagination, you know. So in many ways, the Catholic imagination is this sacramental understanding that God is everywhere, that God is particularly in the sacraments, that God is in God's word, that God is present in history and human experience. Hispanics participate in liturgical life pretty much like everybody else in the United States of America. It is estimated that barely 20% of Catholics in this country go to Mass on a regular basis, okay? 20%. And when I say regular basis, means that about 10% go every Sunday, and the other 10%, the other 10%, they go sporadically. They go to receive sacraments, maybe they go on holidays, they go to funerals, and so on. But 80% of Catholics in this country, in general, do not go to Mass regularly. Now, Hispanics are not the exception. The same numbers apply to Hispanics. There is one difference. And the difference is right here that Hispanics tend to actually participate more in the sacraments of initiation than Euro-American Catholics. Why? Children, my friends. Children, youth, okay? The median age of white Catholics in the United States of America is 55, okay? Median age of white Catholics, 55. The median age of Hispanics in the United States of America is 29, okay? So we're babies, no? And we are a very young population that is having a lot of babies at the same time, okay? So when Hispanics are present, in parishes, you notice that. Those of you who are pastors, those of you who are pastoral leaders, you notice that in the Hispanic community, what's the biggest job that pastors are doing in a Hispanic community? Baptisms, tons of baptisms, and first communions, and confirmations, and quinceañeras, and many other, and blessing babies, and on and on and on. But when your median age is 55, what's the most common celebration besides Mass among the white community? Funerals, you see? And I mean, it's life. I think it's just, it's life, but that is happening. No, in my parish, for instance, the white community is 40% of the entire community, but they put 95% of the funerals, you see? These are the cycles of Catholicism, the cycles of Catholicism. But what's interesting, so I just want you to keep in mind that Hispanics are very active in liturgical life, but in a slightly different way as white Catholics. White Catholics, Mass, and funeral life, and reconciliation when they go to reconciliation. For Hispanics, it's Mass and also the sacraments of initiation, baptisms, first communions, communion, and confirmation. Now, what's interesting is that Hispanics, as Hispanics, negotiate our identity in the context of the church in the United States of America, we are in the midst of a conflict as a community. And the conflict is most Hispanics are culturally Catholic, okay? Are cultural Catholics, meaning that if you lived in Latin America and you come from a Catholic country, when I was born in Colombia, when I was a child in Colombia, 94% of the entire Colombian population was Roman Catholic or self-identified as Roman Catholic. 94%, okay? So that meant that when you get out of your house, everything smells Catholic. You see Catholicism everywhere, Have you noticed that in every single Latin American country, there has been a Marian apparition? And not only one in the past, every day. It's just like all the time there are Marian apparitions, and there are miracles here, and there are altars here, and there's a lot of clergy, and there's a lot of priests, and there's a lot of energy, Same thing in Puerto Rico. Even though Puerto Rico, at the beginning of the 20th century, Puerto Rico was 99% Catholic, 98% Catholic. Today is less than half Catholic, okay? So many of these countries were largely Catholic, and then Catholicism permeated everything. And when, sometimes, people just simply get used to the idea that everything is Catholic, we are Catholic. So people stop going to Mass. They don't go to Mass, but they get Catholicism by watching television, In Colombia and in many other countries in Latin America, you study religion, Catholicism, in public schools, So actually, I got my best catechesis in public school, throughout religion classes when I was a child, when I was a younger person, you see? I say younger because I'm still young, so that's just, in any case. So this cultural Catholicism permeates a lot of it, but the downside of cultural Catholicism is that, it doesn't demand an intentional commitment to practice the sacraments, to learn your faith, and to be intentional in the way you practice your faith every day. For instance, in the United States of America, Hispanic Catholics, particularly Spanish-speaking Catholics, have one of the lowest levels of religious literacy in this country. That doesn't mean that Hispanics don't believe. That's not the case. So they are faithful. They love their faith, but they cannot articulate it. And you will live in a society like the United States of America in which Catholics are not the majority. Only 20% of the US population, 2022 depends on who you ask, 20% of the US population self-identify as Catholic. So we are a minority, and we are constantly in the process of articulating our faith, to defend it, to name it, to bring it into the public. So Latino Catholics are struggling right here, because this cultural Catholicism prevails. Yet, we live in a culture in which intentional Catholicism is more necessary. And finally, there is the challenge of the younger generations. Well, this is kind of the, a little bit of a talk on good news and bad news, okay? The good news is that most Latino adults self-identify as Roman Catholic, keep their faith, even though they don't know how to articulate it, but they keep going to church and baptizing their kids and so on. The bad news is that the second generation is not doing that. And the third generation, even less, okay? So let's take 10 Catholics, okay? Let's think it in terms of tens. So 10 Catholics who are Hispanic Catholics, who are first generation, or 10 Hispanics, who are first generation or recent immigrants, about 6 of them, 6 of 10 will self-identify as Catholic and remain Catholic for the rest of their lives. 6 out of 10. The second generation, only 4 out of 10 will stay in the Catholic Church, Hispanics, the children. So my children, whom I love, and they are catechists, and they are lectors, and they are monaguillos or altar servers, they actually, the chances for them to remain Catholic, based statistically speaking, 4 in 10, okay? My grandchildren, my children's children, 2 out of 10, okay? So in 3 generations, we are losing the Hispanic community. In 3 generations. And generations are short, if you think about it, no? 3 generations, we might be losing the Hispanic community. This is why everyone working with the Latino community is saying, we got to invest in young people today. We're gonna talk about ministry with the Latino community. This is where we need to go. Okay, so if liturgical life is one window or one stream through which Latinos, as a matter of fact, are growing in their faith, are expressing their faith in their spirituality, then we need to start looking at a second one, which is very common, and that is popular Catholicism. So popular Catholicism, let's say a few things about popular Catholicism. Popular Catholicism, okay, we speak about popular Catholicism not in the sense of being popular as Jennifer Lopez is popular, okay? Or as, for instance, drinking a soda is popular or buying a product is popular. Popular Catholicism is called like that because it belongs to the people. It is largely shaped by the experience of the people in their communities. Remember what we were talking about earlier: language, culture, race, stories, narratives. So people in the everyday are constantly making sense of their lives, and that's where Catholicism, begins. So it's popular not in the sense of popularity, but because it constantly takes place in the context where people live, not just in churches, although churches apply it as well or connect as well, but it is also is popular because it happens at home, it happens in the neighborhood, it happens in the places where people are and live. Popular Catholicism, according to Puebla, which is a document that the bishops of Latin America wrote in 1979, popular Catholicism is the language of the people, no? So it's the language that people use to express their faith. It's the language that people use to connect and name God, Remember, a lot of people do not know how to speak of God in theological ways or in scriptural ways. But a lot of people can say, I have this devotion at home. I love to be part of a pilgrimage, no? And remember, I had a student from, I think she's from Nicaragua. I had a student from Nicaragua who once told me, when I was a child, I didn't like church. I just didn't like church because my mother sent me to a church, to catechesis, and it was too heady. And I just didn't understand what was going on, and I didn't want to learn that. But this lady said, I actually like processions. I really like processions. And I like every time there was a procession in my parish, I loved to go to these processions. I didn't understand why, but there was something about those processions that brought me closer to God. As I became an adult, it was processions that kept me Roman Catholic. And now as an adult, I study my faith. And she was studying theology, actually. Now I study my faith, but as a child, I was sustained by popular Catholicism. And it's not only for children, it's for many people, educated or with low levels of education, poor or rich. Popular Catholicism, it provides a language for people to speak about God. Popular Catholicism, usually is associated with what Justo Gonzalez, a theologian, Methodist theologian, calls, spirituality of the margins. Most people who participate in popular Catholicism actually happen to be poor, There is a correlation between getting educated and moving away from popular Catholicism, all around. And actually that happened to white Catholics in the United States of America. The more educated white Catholics became in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, the more they drove away or walked away from popular devotions. For instance, people who are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, most of them remember the Marian crowns when they were younger. They remember devotions, praying the rosary with their grandparents, and so on. But as they became more educated and eventually more secularized, then all these things went away. But many people, they live in the margins. There are 9 million Hispanics in the United States of America who are undocumented. Most of them are Roman Catholic, and many of them are profoundly devout, okay? We know that most Hispanics in the United States of America struggle with poverty, either deep poverty or close to deep poverty. And most of them are Roman Catholic. So you find them here, spirituality of the margins. Popular Catholicism helps us to understand how people understand reality and how they see God in every place. And this is very important. God, through popular Catholicism, is everywhere. God is everywhere. So this is. Let me go back to the example of apparitions. I remember, this is a student, once was writing a thesis at the university, and the student was just looking at newspapers about apparitions, apparitions in Mexico. That was it. Looking at different newspapers. And this student calculated that at least once a week, a major paper would report something of an apparition in Mexico somewhere, okay? A tree, a window, a tortilla, a rock, a wall, a stain, anything, okay? So sometimes, we who live in the North American world, sometimes some of us who are highly educated, we laugh about those things. We just we look down and we say, okay, and so on. However, what these people are telling us is that, even if it's true or not true, what they are telling us is that they are open. They remain open to seeing the face of God everywhere, to at least the possibility that God can become present. I think that that's something that we might have lost in many of our contexts. And popular Catholicism is closely associated with Jesus, Mary, and the saints. Those are the main themes. Look at this, the Via Crucis. Okay, so the way of the cross. This is a practice, that in the United States of America had been almost lost almost lost by the 1970s and 80s. Okay, churches did it, liturgically during Lent. They did it and we still do it as part of the Good Friday liturgies or Lenten Friday liturgies. But what Hispanics and Asian Catholics, because this is not only Hispanics, and Asian Catholics have added to this is they have taken the practice of popular Catholicism and combined it with what's called, what in Spanish is called the pastorela model, is using popular theater. And that's what they do. They reenact, they take the beautiful tradition that we have in our churches, that we continue to have, but now they reenact it, they make it their own, and they take it to the streets. They make popular Catholicism public. It makes a public statement, and there is acting and there's reenacting. And for a lot of people who attend these, if you have seen in many parts of the country, it's quite possible that here in Springfield, somewhere, there are all these traditions. People go, and when people go, they see Jesus being crucified. Sometimes reality blurs. It's like it is that young man who is acting like Jesus, and for a lot of people, is yes, but it's also Jesus. So there's the blurring of reality because it's a spirituality that transcends the common sense. It's a spirituality that is constantly open to the experience of God in the everyday. There's another practice that I love, which is Las Posadas. And it's a beautiful, this is very common among Central Americans and Mexicans, South Americans. Actually, Caribbeans have also embraced it, And this is Mary and Joseph, the community that is a pilgrim community searching for a home. And there is social justice connections, the whole community gets involved, And again, we do this in our churches. We do the Christmas pageant, we do those celebrations. But what's what Latinos are adding to this reenactment dimension, the public dimension of popular Catholicism. So, what are some of the emerging categories that we can identify? Okay, first of all, the first major category that we're going to identify is that the world is a sacred place. So, Hispanics, in many ways, some of you who may have read a little bit more theology and philosophy, at some point, I'm pretty sure you encountered Charles Taylor, And Charles Taylor is a French-Canadian Catholic philosopher who wrote a book on secularism, called A Secular Age. And Charles Taylor says, one of the biggest challenges that we have today, and that's why we are part of this so-called secular world, is that people became disenchanted with reality. People now don't see, we don't see the mystery. We don't see mystery in reality because everything is explained. Science is beautiful, and I love science, but science explains it all, Science explains the body. Science explains nature. Science explains rain. Science explains everything that happens, and we have everything, we can explain everything, and we somehow, reduced the room for mystery, and we don't allow ourselves to see mystery anywhere, okay? So what Latinos are doing through their spirituality, in many ways, is showing us a way that, yes, there is still room for mystery. There is room for a spirituality where God can be present in the universe, even when we can explain the universe. We also know that many of the expressions of popular Catholicism are associated with the sense of fiesta, life, celebration, joy, okay? Sometimes I tend to, I get upset when I watch movies that use stereotypes about Latinos, which are pretty much all movies, that's right. But the stereotypes are either Latinos are criminals or Latinos are always happy, I mean, you can see the two stereotypes in almost every movie, okay? One or the other. And, there used to be a time when I would say, well, I mean, why is this whole thing about Latinos always being happy, always dancing, and always, so there is a stereotype. But, you know what? There's an element of truth to it, There's an element of joy. Even though life is hard for many Latinos and Latinas, life is difficult, and there's a lot of suffering for many of them. The moment of experiencing fiesta, you know, whether in the secular or in the religious sense, is an opportunity to live, to see life as a possibility. Life as a possibility. And that is just powerful. That is powerful. And that's very Catholic as well. So there's the liturgical mestizaje that we already talked about, and we can see that, you know, there's a renewed sense of aesthetics, you know, a renewed sense of aesthetics. And I think that perhaps the most beautiful thing is that unpredictability about seeing God in all things. What's the pedagogical connection of popular Catholicism? For those of you who are catechists, for those of us who are, you know, teachers, or those of us of you who are them. First of all, popular Catholicism doesn't require a theology degree to participate in it. No, anybody can participate. Anyone, a child, a person who doesn't have education, a wealthy person, a person who has many degrees. Doesn't matter. Everybody is welcomed to participate in popular Catholicism and in popular devotions. No. Two, connects to everyone's lives. No. Think, for instance, the Via Crucis, which is beautiful. I mean, everybody dies, and there's a lot of injustice in the world, and people can connect with those realities. Look at all the immigrants who celebrate Las Posadas every Lent. You know, people can understand what it means to search for a new place. It is experienced throughout life. You can do it as a child, as a young person, as an adult, as someone who is at the end of your life, and still will carry a lot of meaning. No, popular Catholicism engages the feelings and engages the senses. You can smell, you can touch, you can see. That's the liturgy. That's what the liturgy does. You know, that's exactly the heart of the liturgy. So it engages feelings. People cry, people laugh, people get excited, people get sad, people get anxious. And all of that is part of worship. In some ways, popular Catholicism does, you know, what sometimes we fail to do in our own spiritual life, engage our bodies in the way, you know. The liturgy does that in a beautiful way, but we don't pay attention to it, you know. So popular Catholicism invites us into this. It challenges, you know, the ideas of beauty. You know, for instance, popular Catholicism somehow invites us to sometimes look at the face of Christ full of blood, for instance, or someone died, a corpse, looking at a corpse. No, in the United States of America, sometimes our Catholicism tends to be a little bit sanitized. You know, I mean, actually, there have been studies on this. You know, in most churches, the most prominent image of Christ in most Catholic churches is the image of Jesus, the risen Jesus. No, the risen Jesus. And there's nothing wrong with it. We believe in the risen Christ, okay? But what's interesting is that Latinos, you know, when Latinos are present, they tend to give more emphasis to the crucified Jesus, okay? Which one is better than the other? None of them, you know? It's simply different facets or different moments of life, of the life of Christ, and we should be able to balance those two, and I think that that's the beauty of Latinos. And we already talked about this, public dimension of the public dimension of Catholicism. Take them to the streets. Okay, the last point that I'm going to make here is what we want to say, the third stream of Hispanic Catholic spirituality. Okay, and that is what we're going to call the ecclesial movements. Okay, so ecclesial movements in the life of the church, I would say, are, you know, a pneumatological moment in the life of our faith community. In other words, the Holy Spirit is blowing, is working, is becoming present in our church in many ways through apostolic movements, okay? Through the ecclesial movements. Some people don't understand the ecclesial movements. Some of us, whether clergy or lay leaders or pastoral associates or theologians, we tend to be overly critical of apostolic movements. I want to invite you to be more attentive to the energy of the Holy Spirit in these spaces, because there's something going on there, you know. Of course, with everything, there are excesses, I mean, without a doubt, but we need to be attentive to them. ecclesial movements are very much in sync with the spirit of the Second Vatican Council and the role of the laity. The ecclesial movements are rarely clergy-driven. Ecclesial movements are actually driven, inspired, guided by the laity with clergy, with the clergy, with vowed religious. And when I say ecclesial movements, I have a few examples here, which I will mention in a few minutes. But ecclesial movements, are these movements that usually have, in many cases, they have a lay leader. Sometimes it's a priest, but it's largely an experience of the laity living a spirituality in an intentional and intense way. In the Hispanic community, we see the apostolic movements or the ecclesial movements. We see them actually very active, and particularly the strongest movement in the Hispanic Catholic community is the Catholic charismatic renewal. Okay, so about half of the parishes with Hispanic ministry in the United States of America has a Catholic charismatic renewal. What's unique about these movements? That these movements, in many ways, allow for expressions, expressions that we want to call, or we could call, neo-Pentecostal, expressions of neo-Pentecostal spirituality. Catholics, in general, we have been shy about letting the Holy Spirit work in our lives. And the Catholic charismatic renewal actually has taught us how to do this. I mean, singing out loud, clapping, hugging, embracing a spirituality that surprises us. That spirituality in the Latino community tends to be more informal and more charismatic, meaning driven by these leaders who are called and inspired by the Holy Spirit. Something that is very interesting, that even though ecclesial movements are inspiring or influencing Hispanics, it's more interesting to notice that many of these ecclesial movements actually have been born or developed in the context of the Hispanic experience. For instance, Cursillo, as the name says it, little course, actually began in Spain, and it's a gift of the Hispanic community. It's a gift of the Hispanic community to the entire church. It's one of the most influential ecclesial movements in the church, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. And it's not only Catholics who have been influenced, I mean, you need to read the story of Jose Miguel Bonines. So the Cursillo is not only influential in the Catholic community, but also influential in other Christian communities, Protestant, mainstream Protestant, and also evangelical. The Catholic charismatic renewal, which historically begins in the United States of America, okay? So it begins as a small movement in a university in the United States of America in Ohio, okay? What happens to the Catholic charismatic renewal? Missionaries from the United States of America take the Catholic charismatic renewal to the Caribbean, particularly the Dominican Republic, and to Latin America. In Latin America, it spreads like fire and then comes back roaring into the United States of America. The version that we have, the most dynamic version of the Catholic charismatic renewal that we have today, it has been imported from Latin America. Same Holy Spirit, okay, but similar dynamics here. And then there is a movement that is spirituality and catechesis that in the Hispanic community, called in Spanish Juan 23. It's a very popular movement, and it's popular in the Caribbean community among Puerto Ricans, but it's also popular among US-born Latinos, and this is growing fast. The neo-catechumenal way So some of you may be familiar with it. Also born in Spain, okay? And this is born, founded or established by a missionary, a lay missionary, who decides to go to the poorest neighborhoods in Madrid, and then they start, evangelizing. That's what they do, evangelize. And they use the model of the catechumenate, the model of the catechumenate, to do their own work. Hundreds of thousands, I believe millions, already throughout the world are members of the neo-catechumenal way. But these are not the only movements, the only ecclesial movements. There are many others that also have some quote-unquote Latino roots, no? For instance, Focolare in Italy, no? Saint Egidio, also in Italy, or if you want to call Communion and Liberation, no? So all these movements, those ecclesial movements, I personally see them as engines of spiritual life, no? But they don't replace the Eucharist, they don't replace the scriptures, and if they ever do, then we need to question them, okay? But they don't replace the parish. They support, they give life to people. In the Latino community, these movements are becoming one of the best sources of spiritual life. So, to conclude, don't forget the three streams that in many ways sustain, channel, give life to the Latino community and its spirituality. On the one hand, the liturgy, the sacraments of the church, no? That's key. We cannot, there is no value for us to speak about popular religion or ecclesial movements if there is not a connection to the liturgy, okay? So we begin there. The liturgy, central to the life of the Latino community, and that's why we need to keep cultivating this. Two, popular religion, okay? Most Catholics in the United States of America are sustained by popular religion more than actually the actual celebrations of the liturgy. Why? Because most Hispanic Catholics don't go to Mass, or they don't receive the sacraments. But many practice altarcitos, quinceañeras, and many of these celebrations. So what we need to do is start channeling the energy of this popular Catholicism into the celebration of the liturgy, so they all become one whole spirituality, not a fragmented spirituality. And the third stream, ecclesial movements that are growing and injecting new life to the Catholic Church in this country. So we're living, I think, in a time of spiritual growth, a kairos in many ways in the Catholic Church in the United States. And I forgot to write the word renewal. This is a time of spiritual renewal, spiritual kairos, okay? And thanks to the Hispanic presence. The Hispanic presence is renewing our church, and we need to pay attention to this. So the question is, are our pastors, are our catechists, are our theologians paying attention to these dynamics? I think that as we move into the 21st century, we cannot afford ignoring those realities. This is our church, and this is a gift for us in the 21st century. Thank you very much. Sure.
Okay, so we have a little bit of time for questions. We can figure out if your audience on here could type the questions to you, you could then read them. Sister Carol's going to monitor the others in the room, if you join them. But are there folks in the live audience here who have questions?
And it could be questions or comments as well, reactions to what you heard.
Professor, I've learned so much from you. I want to thank you.
Thank you.
I also want to ask you if you could give us a sense of the influence of liberation theology on these movements in our church and on the life of our
Thank you. Well, there is no doubt that liberationist movements, you know, in theological, particularly theological, no, let me just rephrase this. There is no doubt that in Latin America, much of the energy associated with small communities was closely associated or closely influenced by liberation theology. And I think that the Latino community brings into the United States a powerful sense of the small community, without, you know, the political, perhaps, leaning that it might have had in Brazil or El Salvador or in other parts of Latin America. But what we can rescue from these communities is the power of the small church, the domestic church, you know, the small communities that pray together, and they actually were injecting new energy to parishes, to dioceses throughout the country. In the United States of America, I mean, historically, in the 1970s, you know, there was a large number of base communities or ecclesial-based communities, but they were not supported. They were not supported by a hierarchy. They were not supported by many members of the clergy. And some of them disappeared, and others morphed more into the traditional prayer group, you know, the small ecclesial community, which I find normal. You know, I mean, all these movements, you know, are expressions of a spirituality that need to adjust, you know, to the context in which they are. But I think that with Pope Francis, there is a growing number of small communities that, you know, without using the language of liberation theology or liberationist approaches, they're using the language of social justice and social commitment. And I think that there is a lot of potential there. And I believe that we're moving in the right direction in that sense. We are reclaiming Catholic social teaching, and Catholic social teaching cannot be understood without a profound spiritual tradition. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Ospino, thank you so much for joining us. We could all go together and show our appreciation.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for the invitation and the opportunity to kick off this series of reflections. And I wish you the best as, you know, as you continue to meet. And Bishop, once again, thank you for being with us, and thank you for the invitation as well, Chris. Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely,
Dr.
no, absolutely.
It was really fabulous.
Thank you, thank you.
I might have you come back.